What I'd like to do is give a quick reprise of the report that many of you have on your in-trays or certainly on your chairs today. And what we've done over the last 2 months with the help of my colleagues, I emphasise, is put together your latest plans for what you're trying to do in the North Sea and your intentions over the next years. And as always, trying to look at those and compare those with past stories to see how we're doing, where we're going, and what the trend is for us all in this basin. I'd like to, as in all good talks, do it in 3 parts. First of all, what has happened. Secondly, what is happening. And then thirdly, what could happen. And with all these things, you've got to start somewhere. So as James mentioned, you can't but start with oil price. 2011, yet another curious year for oil price, quite amazing. $111 last year. I took this job on in Oil and Gas UK in 2003. Yes, I am this old. And when I started then, oil price was $30 a barrel. 2004, it averaged $40 a barrel, and you guess in 2005, it averaged $50 a barrel. And with the odd wobble in between, it seems to be going up $10 a year, $111 last year, and this year, we're starting at $120. I, at some point, think that rule's going to break. I really do. And certainly, if we look and we were to try and take out some of the geopolitical instability, many commentators believe that the oil price would actually come quite substantially down from where we are now. And it's certainly a very interesting question to ask, how can our basin cope below $100 oil price? The pain we do see, though, obviously moving through to the rest of the economy, because in 2008, we had an exchange rate heading towards $1.80 to the pound. I'll get this right yet. $1.80 to the pound, whereas, as we know at the minute, it's 1.56. And so our barrels are very expensive in pounds, and we're actually topping £80 a barrel. Quite an extraordinary period. It's quite interesting, though, that Treasury got one thing right last year. It predicted $111 oil price for the year in its budget statement in March, and it was right. That's what it was. It's slightly over-predicted on gas price last year, which was 56 pence a therm. So gas, yet again, still sits at about half of oil price. And as one of the interesting things last year, James mentioned, we've had a long set of conversations with the government about taxation, oil prices, development costs. But the government keeps insisting to us that gas development costs are much less than oil development costs. And we've managed to evidence the contrary to them, but still this goes on where there's obviously a mismatch in their understanding of our business. So if last year was a quite amazing year for oil price, if we look a little deeper, we see quite a different picture for our business. In 2011, we didn't do so well on many of the metrics that I know many of you would track with your scorecards and your business leaders. Production was down 18%. Exploration down 50%, down by half. Even development drilling was down by about 7% last year, with 121 wells drilled. And capital expenditure, yes, that was up last year. We'll come back to that in a minute. It's quite an interesting story. And as already has been mentioned, the tax burden in our industry was raised by 24% last year. And the cost of doing our business rose by a quarter again last year. So pretty difficult challenges, despite the current oil price. Are these the signs of a basin in distress or a sign of a basin in change? And perhaps we can look at that in a minute. 2011 was a stellar year for production performance, if only the 90 fields that produced extra were the only news, then we would have cracked the production target last year and be seeing a basin which was overproducing. Unfortunately, another 200 fields underproduced last year. And as a result of that, we saw the production fall by about 18%. Now, these just all sound percentages and numbers, but clearly for many of the people in the room, many of the businesses in the room, these were very demanding years last year, and I think still are very demanding in what they're trying to do to actually assure their production base and sustain their businesses. One of the big themes last year was in Q2 and Q3, we saw a massive, not much more than 18%, 30-40% drop in production in some months compared with the year before, as companies faced a whole range of unscheduled outages and in some cases also girded their loins and got on to do some major infrastructure work. And one of the things that came out of us in the survey was, as we started to go around companies and see where their investment plans were for last year and where the capital went last year, what we see time and time again was additional unproductive capital spent to actually assure the production base, but not deliver new production, being spent all over the business. And certainly our own totting up of that capital looks like £500 million extra was spent last year simply to assure the production base and working infrastructure to try and address the unscheduled outages across the North Sea. Production demand for our basin, also oil demand, will take every last barrel you can get. Production demand for gas was also constrained by gas demand in the UK. The economy is still suffering from the hangover of 2008 and still on the way back up, as we all know. And that did affect gas demand, and as I say, that was down about 12% last year. Production also was made less pleasant to look at because in 2011 we only saw 5 new fields coming on stream. And none of these were big, so together they only added 30 million barrels to the production base. So last year we were only adding 5% of the production we were delivering. So a very demanding year, and one which certainly for production means that last year we saw a big dip, and it's going to take quite some years to get back on track. Like all of these things, when people are predicting cheerful, they over-predict. When people are predicting glum, they tend to under-predict, but still, our best look is by 2020, we'll only then be back on track. And even on current plans, it'll be something into the next decade before we recover the production we've lost, obviously with the matching loss of value and, frankly, the uncertainty that comes with it. I put this slide up because it's a very colourful one, but what it shows is each year by year what our operating costs are doing and the forecast on operating costs. As you notice, it has risen over the years, as James has well said. But this last year, the big camelback of increase again was the impact of the loss of production. We're managing to keep costs under control, which is a good place to be at. And certainly across the basin, operating costs generally rising a few percent, but not by anything spectacular, which is a good measure of the fact that the basin isn't overheating. It might be feeling warm, but it's not overheating. But last year, certainly, when it comes to cost per barrel, a 25% increase was what was measured, and that, for some fields, must really be damaging their profitability. And certainly, when you look at those, if we see a sub-$100 oil price, these sort of metrics will really come into play as to whether the basin is sustainable. So difficult news for many companies in terms of the operation of their businesses, but what you also see was it's difficult news for Treasury as well. So last year at the budget time, God bless them, Treasury said that the tax measures introduced would raise over £13 billion. And by November, when they did the autumn statement, they had to revise those down so that they knocked $2.3 billion off of their income statement from this industry. And they now predict we're going to have given last year just over £11 billion of tax revenues to the Exchequer. It shows several things. First of all, the Treasury and DEC were no more aware of the production fall than we were. And certainly they were not sighted on what was happening until the late summer. And that underlines the challenge we have in working with the government and with the regulator on making the most of our business. And for the Treasury also, it's a major business issue. You know, you have to go to your boss and say, I'm sorry, George, we've got $2 billion less coming from this industry list this year. So how well do you understand your business? And are you actually working alongside those people and what you're trying to deliver? Also for the economy, the Daily Telegraph pointed out that GDP at the end of last year was lower than it could have been because of the output from our industry. And our best estimate is that GDP was 0.2% lower last year because of the failure to do all the production that we'd intended to achieve. Our imports as a country were also something like £7 or £8 billion higher last year. So even here from Aberdeen, we have a big impact on the whole of the UK economy from our success or from our failure. So what I'd like to do then, we've talked a little bit about what has been going on. I'd like to give you a perspective on what is and could be going on. And I'll pick up on 4 main areas. Just to look at the reserves, see what's going on in investment, because there are some amazing things going on in investment. Pick up a little bit on the E&A trends, and then something on decommissioning. First, looking at the reserve story, what we see in our survey is that altogether, if you've add all of the reserves up, that people are trying to pursue, as well as those that got in the bag, we're doing something over 10 billion barrels of opportunities at the minute. But taking a step back, a year ago, if we just walked from my left to my right, goodness knows what it is for you, but from my left, a year ago we were expecting to produce, well, we had tied in about 6 billion barrels. We produced 0.6 of a billion, and then, because of the investments I'll come back to in a minute, we added 1.8 billion barrels. So, 1/112, we've got either connected to our infrastructure or being connected and getting ready to produce over 7 billion barrels of oil and gas. That's something like 10 years production flat on its own, which is a great place to start. And it's the first year for many where we've seen that big step up. We're about 5 years back before we were last at that place, which is a good place to be moving to. We then, if you look, we have some probable, so greater than 50% chance of being developed reserves together, which add up to then 10 billion in total for our business. So yeah, that doesn't feel too bad place, but I would say that when we looked at this model, this picture a year ago, you actually got the same story. So the P50 expectation of reserves and resources being connected or being developed a year ago was about 10 billion barrels, and is still, a year later, about 10 billion barrels. So what we've done in the last year is bring an awful lot into production or into ready to produce. We're busy developing this stuff, but we're struggling to add more things at the back end of the business and get them mature enough to be able to develop. Despite the current high oil prices, despite the massive effort and activity of the many people in this room. It's worth looking a little at what actually is going on. And over these last years, what we see here is a list of fields on DEC's website that have been given FID during the year. And these are not just fields, some cases as well, they're major redevelopments of fields, so something like Schiehallion or Clare, for instance. And over 2007, 8 and 9, we'd seen some pretty turgid activity. Great for the people doing it, but putting a couple of £1 billion in and developing parts of 1 billion barrels of oil and gas. Those clearly put the money in, it takes some years to spend, and it takes many years to produce those barrels of oil and gas. But this shows you sort of a thermometer of activity. 2010, we saw a big step up of activity as things like Lagan Tormore and Jasmine got into play. And then last year, 2011, we saw 16 fields or major redevelopments taking place, and those together initiated £14 billion of new capital investment. Clearly, that won't all be spent this year, won't all be spent last year, so over a few years, as we'll see in a minute, but a major step up of activity. Like all these things, though, it's almost a two-speed level of activity. What we have is major icebergs, mountains of investment, so the top 5 opportunities being developed currently account for something like 85% of all the capital currently being spent. Pretty similar for 2010. So lots of little stuff and some very big things moving through the business. Now, they've been hanging around for a while, some of these things, but still these are very major opportunities and really setting the pace for development. And it would be churlish to do anything other than celebrate that level of activity. Many of these things are providing investment, employment and skills, not just in Aberdeen, but across Britain. And I know in some of these major projects, the British content is rising to something like 90%. So we are in these things doing our bit for Britain, undoubtedly. But what it means is that we have everyone's eyes concentrated on the big stellar stuff, and then we see these little opportunities slipping through. They're great to have, but they are the routine business of this basin, with, for once, some big stuff happening. One of the very important things for us as an industry is to be able to have 2 eyes, one looking at the big stuff and one looking at the little stuff, and recognizing we need both to contain and happen if we have a successful business. So how does that actually play out? If you look again at investment, 2010, this is a chart showing how much we've been investing per year over the last years and what we think we'll spend in 2012. 2010, we spent about £6 billion. 2011, we spent, we think now, about £8.5 billion. A year ago, we were saying it could have been up to 8, and we see that last £500 million has very much gone into things like asset integrity. And that story, I'm sure, will continue for 2012. But we start to see that wave of capital, and you see the blue investment is the major stuff that was approved in 2010, washing through the system. And now we see an even bigger wave going through in 2011 and 12 and beyond of the extra step up of activity. So just remembering, though, that in that 2011 capital, there are 16 fields in there, but 5 of them are enormous, and then the other 10 or so are smaller. And as you get down there, each one of those has its own story and its own chance to development. Our best call now for 2012 is, as we see on the right-hand side there, an additional probably a $2 billion capital being spent in 2012 for yet more new developments. Some of the heavy oil stuff looks like it's about to take off, which would be great news. It's been hanging around a long time, but that is symptomatic of some of the things that are now washing through the system. James mentioned capital efficiency or costs, and as he said, things ain't what they used to be. So 10 years ago, the best sort of analogy I would give, just over 10 years ago, Pilot was set up in, gosh, more than 10 years ago now, isn't it? 1999, 2000 it was set up as something that was trying to guide what we should be trying to do in 2010. And they then set the target, the goal, the aspiration that we would be spending $3 billion of capital, in their eyes, in those days money, still in 2010. They thought that was a stellar amount to invest. This last year, well, in 2010 we were actually spending 6. In the last year, something like 8.5. And it shows they thought those 3 billions that James had said would give you something over 1 billion barrels of oil and gas. 2011, we'll probably spend about 8.5 billion. So just if you just took that slice of money, that would convert into about 800 million barrels. So even though we're now seeing some very large sums being spent in our business, the reason we can accommodate them in part is because the money doesn't go as far as it used to. And to be honest also, I think the supply chain has geared up enormously in the last few years. One of the things that the spike in oil price in 2008 did was it shook up the whole of our industry as to how to manage at these high levels of activity, not just here but globally. And many companies are showing by their level of activity that they can do it, and they are doing it. I'd also, I couldn't resist, be slightly churlish here and point out that in 2002 to 2004 we started to see investment fall. In 2006 through to 2008-09, again we saw investment fall. And it is interesting to note that both of those points coincided with new increases in taxation on our industry. And certainly one of our private fears, which we hope will not come to pass, is that this latest tax increase will cause more things to fall by the wayside. Very much going back to the theme that James said, this is a business for both us and for government. And they have to realise what they're doing is setting the dial on activity by what they declare in the tax regime. Exploration was a funny old thing last year, and as we can see, we've got a projection here of what could happen in exploration over these next 3 or 4 years, or 3 years in fact. One of the things you do see, exploration is very hardwired to oil price, and the picture here shows exploration and appraisal activity over the last 10 years, and then the correlation against it of oil price, annual oil price, and you can see one pretty much follows the other. As the oil price rises, we've seen exploration activity increase across the North Sea. But then last year, and particularly the year before last, we started to see a big deleveraging of oil price and activity, so the two separated heavily. And that change was very much part of a worry which led us last year to see this cut in exploration activity by half, even compared to what was planned. We're expecting something like 30 wells for exploration. Half of that actually happened. We discovered something about 175, maybe 180 million barrels because of it. So it wasn't a stellar year. The concern is, how do we get back on track? As James has mentioned, we need lots of exploration wells if we're going to fulfill the potential of this basin. The current rate of activity, quite simply, isn't good enough. In fact, when you look back, it was last this low in 1964, 65, before they actually started developing the northern oil provinces. So we have a gap to fill up. The chance will be that we see more activity this year. Certainly the plans which people tabled last year, and then many of them dropped by the wayside for a whole range of reasons: access to finance, dare I say it, higher taxation, demand for rigs in other basins. The whole thing seems to be coming back on track, and we hope that is really the case. If we do, then we will see activity stepping up this year. And the positive view is, and you'll see in the report, that all areas of the basin are still being and continue to be targeted, with much greater activity and focus west of Shetland. So the potential and the activity are out there. We have to see whether they'll actually materialise in these next few years. So it's also worth just looking at the other end of the life cycle. For some years now, I've been putting a curve up, quite some years now, showing that every time you look, that costs go up. It was quite a relief last year to see that decommissioning costs have gone up a little bit, but not by very much, which is a great place for a change. And a lot of these projections many years out clearly have a bit of a wing and a prayer, because what your decommissioning costs are going to be 40 years out, goodness only knows. But what we actually saw was that decommissioning expenditure in totality was pretty much what was seen the year before, albeit with a little bit of inflation for domestic costs in there. Also what we saw was the whole noise of some fields moving closer to cessation of production, others moving backwards, but more moved back than forward last year. And certainly over the next decade and a half, what we see is a slight slowdown of expenditure, as more fields were delaying their cessation of production than were bringing them forward. And certainly if we get the drive to try and focus on new investments in brown fields sorted, we will see this continue as a much greater trend. The outcome, though, is I think decommissioning expenditure through to 2020 could be about 10% lower than we were anticipating a year ago. Clearly, there's some uncertainty in all of these sorts of figures because of the dynamics and the timing, but certainly the latter half of this decade, we see a slowdown in decommissioning activity. So, if you like, we've talked a little bit about what is going on. Now it's worth looking a little bit about what could go on. And for our industry, it's around relationships. It's around relationships with the regulator. It's around relationships with the Treasury. Do they actually understand our business? Are they as committed as we are to make the most of it for the UK as well as for our shareholders? And one of the big progresses in the last year, and it was shown best by the meeting we had in January the 16th, in fact, in January this year, was with Chloe Smith, the new Economic Secretary for the Treasury, the Minister responsible for our industry, and Charles Hendry, where they together met us as an industry to talk about the fiscal regime, its relationship with our industry, how that drives investment, and how they make it the success it can be for them as shareholders in our industry through the tax regime. So there's been a much higher level of engagement in the last 6 months with Treasury at the very top levels than there was in the preceding 2 years. Maybe a little bit too late for some of us, but a great place to be nonetheless, that we are highly engaged with Treasury, and they are trying to do their bit to really understand the business dynamics of our industry. I think it's still a long way to go, though, because if you reflect back, they too struggle to predict the tax yield from our industry even only 6 months ago. But the focus for us and for them comes on two main themes. Certainty on decommissioning, that we know what will happen when we get there and who's going to pay what share of the bill, and competitiveness. And I'll just show you a little bit of the implications of that. James has talked about engagement with government on field allowances. What you see here is the trajectory for capital spend based on the plans that you've sent us. The grey stuff is what's going on at the minute, and the top end of that grey stuff in light grey shows what's currently getting field allowances. Things which are actually going ahead in part because the government has softened the tax regime enough to help the investor make that investment decision. It's classic of that would be, for instance, in here something like Lag and Tormore, which only got investment approval because of the introduction of field allowances to reflect the huge burden on that development. Then you see some of the new stuff which could happen, the probable new developments, and some of the brownfield stuff around it, so things like Mariner Bressay would be sitting in that tranche of stuff, likely to go ahead, but not yet getting firm investment decision. And then you see on top of that, a whole raft of projects, which James mentioned, which are struggling and will not go ahead within the current regime. But if we see a little softening in the tax regime, if we see some adjustments to the field allowances, could actually proceed. And that's what we're playing for currently, the next wave of investment after the current one. If the country likes what it sees, it should enjoy this even more, because if it goes ahead, it does so and delivers something like £20 billion of investment and something just under probably £20 billion worth of tax yield directly to Treasury. So these are still big business opportunities which can actually of themselves deliver both for us as a basin and for the UK economy some great things. The other side of our conversations with Treasury have been around decommissioning. I make no bones, we want to delay decommissioning as long as possible. It's a great piece of business when you get there, but it's still a pity to have to clear up after a good party. It's much better continuing with the investment and the activity, maximising recovery of those resources. And the big theme, so in 2011, the government announced that it was capping decommissioning relief, which might seem quite technical for some of you in the room, but what that announcement meant was that our industry suddenly found an additional $3 billion of costs pushed back on it from the government to industry for decommissioning. It continued to underline the uncertainty that there is within our industry as to how much of the bill government will foot when it comes to decommissioning. And without that certainty, it's very hard to plan mid-late life businesses, harder to buy and sell assets, harder to have the confidence to invest in those assets, and it makes it easier to decide to turn the lights off than keep the lights on some of the businesses in the North Sea. And over the last 6 months, we've put an enormous amount of work as an industry with government in means to solve this without costing the government a penny. And I emphasise that. What we're looking to do simply is to be sure that when we get there, the rules of the game today apply then. And certainly as an industry, the best professional advice we've had is that the best way to do that is with a contract. So that we and the government together contract that when we get there, we'll do our side of the bargain and they'll do their side of the bargain. And these, taken with the other measures, both on extending the field allowance regime, we think together can add something like 3 billion barrels of production over the next years in the North Sea. By my maths, that's something like 30 or 40 billion pounds of capital investment straight from those activities alone. What they start to do is create the next wave of investment and bring the next wave of companies into our basin. I was stuck on a flight from Aberdeen to London, as occasionally one is, and flicking through a publication from one of the big accounting firms. And it showed that at the minute, the UK is only attracting something a bit under 4% of global capital. And at the back of the book, it had a list of the top 75 oil companies. I really was bored. You can see I was actually seeing how many of them I knew were active in the North Sea. And still only a very few. And it's measures such as this decommissioning one and the field allowances measures that we're talking about start to open the door up to show that, in this case, Britain is truly open for oil and gas business from all those many companies that could come in but are not yet in the North Sea. So, to wind up, from my point of view, the challenge is very much one of trying to continue the current dynamic. We're seeing a splendid wave of investment going through at the minute. It would be churlish to do anything other than celebrate the fact that after more than 40 years, we're spending so much money. Most of that is highly productive money delivering great new opportunities for skills and investment. And for each pound we spend in capital, a direct pound goes straight to the Treasury in production over time. So this is a business win for both the industry and for government. The more we spend, the bigger the economy gets. But for us, investment can only happen if we have the confidence in the long-term agenda, and that comes down to, do we trust government to be part of the journey rather than just for one-stop ride? Malcolm, I'll pass back to you now, and for Derek. Thank you very much indeed.